So as we get started today on TikTok Tuesday, I want to talk about anxious moms. And the reason that I want to talk about this is that, like I said, once in a while, I start to see things within my practice, within the families that I'm working with, where I really start to notice some of the things that are impacting our clients. And one of those is anxious mothers. Anxious fathers do it too, but I'm going to tell you, we see a lot less fathers participate in this program. We have a couple who are amazing. But for the most part, we see mom as the leader when it comes to trying to get their children's health back on track, which to me is fascinating because for most of our families, dads are very hands-off. They are not participating in this project. So when I'm talking about anxious moms, it's because that's what I see. That's what I see the majority of. So if you're dads out there and you're watching, please don't be offended. I'm not ignoring you. It is just that we mostly see the majority of moms in our practice. So I was on the phone yesterday and I was talking to a client and she was just like, it's just too hard. You know how to do it. You've been doing it. And so I was awake a lot last night thinking about this. And I was like, we're changing the topic for today. So when we talk about anxious mothers, I can speak to this in volumes because I am a mother and I was also anxious once, just like you. So growing up, I was an extremely anxious child. I hated people to look at me. Someone would look at me and I would freak out and, oh my gosh, they're looking at me. I was extremely paranoid. Always thought somebody was trying to kidnap me or steal me. Yes, that actually did happen on one occasion. Somebody did try to get me in their van. But I was definitely that anxious mother and I didn't know it was anxiety. So when you grow up in the 80s, you're an 80s baby and you are a product of probably another anxious mother. I never realized that it was anxiety. I always thought it was part of my personality. That's just who I was. I was a worrywart. I was extremely shy. If you can believe it, I was very shy as a child. I did not want to talk to anybody. I did not want to draw attention to myself. I was very anxious. So as I grew, my symptoms continued to get worse. And by the time I was in college, my anxiety was through the roof. Of course, I still didn't know at this time that it was anxiety. That's what it was called. But I got to the point where I would get to the finals in college and my throat would just be sore and swollen with canker sores, just caked with canker sores. Because I was under so much stress and so much anxiety that my body would just start to break down and I would start to get sick and I was covered in these canker sores and it was miserable. And so I had gone to the health center in college and they told me, oh, well, you just have anxiety. You need to be taking some Paxil. So I didn't know. I'm like, okay, well, maybe this will really help. So I started taking Paxil and I actually had a really bad reaction to it. It made me really pretty sick. I felt like I had the flu. And so I said, you know what, this isn't for me. I had some other health symptoms going on as well at the time, but nobody ever connected the fact that I had vertigo horribly at the age of 19 with all of these other things that I was experiencing in my life. So I will tell you that when my son was diagnosed, I was still a very anxious mother, very anxious. And it wasn't until he was about 5 years into his tick diagnosis that I changed so much about what I was doing because I had figured out so much about my son. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. But as we start to look at how anxious mothers can impact their children, it is a really important aspect. And I have read tons of studies. I've actually written my own book that we have not published about anxious mothers and the impact that they have on their children. And we actually have a brand new colleague that we are working with where we are sending some of the mothers that we are working with to help rein in some of this anxiety. So I often see that in our practice, the clients who are the most successful are the clients who, one, the moms stick to the program, two, the moms are very confident, and three, the anxiety level of those mothers is very, very low, is very, very limited. And I will tell you that I have not always been in this position where I knew all of this stuff about nutrition and all of this stuff about genetics. That's absolutely not the case. I was a homeschooling mom. Well, my kids were in elementary school, and then I became a homeschooling mom in the process of my son getting a tick diagnosis. I was not a PhD. I was not Dr. Gibson. I was Piper, the mom, who was trying to figure out how to help my son get his health back on track, because I was watching him struggle. I was terrified. My husband was terrified. We were so scared, and we look back now on all of the things that we thought he's never going to be able to drive a car or get a job or do these things, because all he could do was move his body uncontrollably, and he was exhausted at the end of the day, and we were exhausted at the end of the day. And my anxiety did not help, because when my anxiety early on was off the charts, my child can feel that. My child gets that. When I'm like this and I'm edgy and I'm having that crying or that altered voice where I'm speaking in a higher register, or I'm just so upset, or I just am like, stop, please stop. Like, I just can't take it anymore. My child felt that. My children understood that I was under the same amount of anxiety, and my anxiety was influencing them. So it was a huge deal for me. And it wasn't until we started working on the genomics with WIT that I realized that my lifelong anxiety came from food sensitivities. It came from trauma that I had experienced, and it came from the gluten intolerance, and then it also came from lack of nutrients. So I wasn't getting all the genetic nutrition that I need. And once I started applying that, my anxiety went away. I no longer live in that anxious state where I am feeling like there's a sense of impending doom, like something bad is going to happen. I no longer live in that state. And I do really now look back and believe that that was really kind of a turning point for us, because when I was able to manage myself, I was better able to help manage my child. And I see that every single day in my practice, every day. The mothers that are able to manage their own stress and anxiety, their children see a higher amount of success in our program because they are able to manage their own anxiety. And I find it fascinating. And I really feel like the more that I'm in this space, working with families and working with parents and working with mothers and children, that I can step back now, all of these years later, and see that connection, that anxiety connection in other parents. So let's talk about a few studies. You can hear me speak about this, but there are actually studies that I've been looking at for many, many years. And the other thing we want to talk about is, mom guilt. So many of us feel like, oh my gosh, it's my fault. What did I do wrong that my kid has this tic disorder? And it's not you. It is not your fault. It's not your husband's fault. It's not your dog's fault. Your child is just in this space where it is a perfect storm for these symptoms to arise. And I can look at that when we look at your kids' test results, when we look at your children's results, we can look at that and we can say, oh my gosh, look at all of these connections. Look at all of these reasons, all of these drivers that your children are seeing increased symptoms. Tics, ADHD, SPD, OCD, all of the things. We can look at these underlying drivers when we are looking at the testing data. So I can clearly point out to you, this is not your fault. Your child got a parasite. It is not your fault your child got a parasite. Your child was exposed to mold, which means you were exposed to mold. So it's not your fault. You had a leak in your house and you were completely unaware. It isn't your fault. So we have to start to look at the fact that mom guilt is real. There are some studies. There was a pediatric study on mothers who had the inability to breastfeed, and the guilt that they felt that actually impacted their child was really very significant. So, when we're starting to look at these different studies, I'm going to talk about 3 of them this morning. I want everybody to understand, I am you. I was you. I have been in your shoes. I have been the anxious mother of a child who has an uncontrollable tic disorder and a laundry list of symptoms. But I can now say, I've seen the light. I've seen the forest through the trees. I've come out on this other side where I can now look at other families who are experiencing what we experienced and be able to point this out. It's like, you're barreling down the highway at 120 miles an hour and you're like, yeah, go faster. No, nobody? No, I'm not either. I'm just saying, it's like you're barreling down the highway at 120 miles an hour and it's called high speed wobble. You just are so anxious and out of control and out of sorts. And then you see a cop and you're like, oh, you have to slow down. And then your body's like, what the heck? You're pumping the brakes, but you're trying to go faster. You're pumping the brakes and you're trying to go faster. And there's this whole cortisol release within your body, really, and starting to increase the inflammation and anxiety. So there are 3 studies. The first study, published in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, found that maternal experiences of childhood. So things that you as a parent experienced as a child, especially if it was neglect, you were associated with worse mental health in mothers. So we can see this. If you maybe had some neglect or some trauma as a child, we see that this impacts your maternal mental health. But what's really astounding, in turn, we can see that the trauma you experienced, your mental health, actually will in turn influence your child, and your child can have greater feelings of anxiety, depression, and social withdrawal. And so we have to look at this generational impact of anxiety on trauma. And we have to realize that somebody someday needs to break that cycle. And whether or not it's you or whether or not it's down the line, I think it's really important for families to understand that the anxiety that you are feeling around your child's illness is absolutely normal, but it is impacting their health. And therefore, it is extremely important to work on you as the parent, as the mother, because when you can better manage yourself, your emotions, and your anxiety, you are going to better be able to address the situation and the things that you are dealing with when it comes to your child and their laundry list of symptoms. So there is another study, it's a meta-analysis, where this study actually revealed some significant correlation between maternal anxiety, right? We're talking about moms with anxiety today, and their preschool children. And what this study found is those preschool children were more prone to internalizing and externalizing problems. They had more problem-like behavior. They needed more correction. And you can really emphasize the impact of maternal mental health on their children's development, especially at a young age. So when we're starting to look like your child has the symptoms coming on at 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, they're still developing. I mean, boys are developing until they're about 26 years old, give or take, females about 18 to 20. And so when we start to look at this development, your child is still in development, and your mood, your anxiety, the impression that you are imprinting on your child at this point will also impact their mental health. I mean, when we look at genomics and epigenetics, it's very similar. So this is an epigenetic factor, meaning there's an outside influence that is going to actually impact the way that your genes express, the way that your genes send a signal. And there is a study that has been done on fish. And we looked at fish and their environment, and whether it was a toxic environment, a stressful environment, these kinds of things, these fish, we can see several generations, 6 generations down the line, that these fish that had lived in this really stressful, anxious type environment, their offspring, 6 generations down the line, experienced similar symptoms, the similar anxiety, the stress, the behaviors. So you can see that you have this epigenetic factor. Yes, this is outside influence. Epigenetic is this outside influence that is going to influence the way that your cells communicate, express, and send a signal. So you have to understand that, yes, right now, as an anxious mother who has a child with a chronic illness, when you display that anxiety in front of your child, it can actually start to change their genes. And so this is really an interesting scientific discovery, because we know that we need to start treating ourselves better. We need to learn how to manage our own emotions so that our children can then start to thrive. And I see it every single day in my practice. I'm going to tell you that the families where the moms are better able to manage their anxiety and emotions, those kids see a much bigger rate of healing, of getting back on track, of seeing their tic symptoms reverse, all because we can see this influence of mom. And so it's really, really important when we start to talk about anxious moms is that you have to realize, when we look at the holistic approach, you as the parent are part of that process, of part of getting your child back on track. And research has shown both maternal postpartum anxiety and depression can affect child development and family functioning, with long-term implications on both child and paternal health. So not only are those things early on, if you have this postpartum depression, and not everybody has it. I mean, we can really look at this, and Bailey will fully talk about this as well. I didn't have any postpartum depression, at least not that I look back and can see any of that. I definitely had postpartum stress because my child didn't sleep. But Bailey really talks about the fact that she experienced that postpartum depression. And we can see in this study that postpartum depression can really impact your child, but also your husband. So looking at the fact that your emotions are going to impact everybody else in your life. And I'm not saying this is purely mom, because it is not, because dad has his own emotions, dad has his own anxiety and stress, and yes, that is going to impact the child. We also see that, when it comes to the family dynamic within the practice, the families where dad is on board and dad is helpful and dad is like, let me share in this responsibility of helping our kid get back on track, those families also are far more successful, because we have this power dynamic of mom and dad who are managing anxiety, who are managing emotions, who are not trying to get stuck in the stress and the overwhelm of, oh my gosh, I cannot watch this child struggle anymore. It's so stressful. Those families really start to see some of the biggest benefits from our program. And I'm not saying that that's the only case. I'm just saying I really, really notice that you guys as the moms are experiencing this anxiety and this overwhelm and this stress and this burden where you feel like you have to do everything. You feel like you have to take your kid to the doctor's appointment. You have to give them the prescriptions. You have to give them the supplements. You have to cook the dinner. You have to do the laundry. You have to drive them to soccer practice. And you still have to work, and you've never had any time to grieve. And you're like, what? Never had any time to grieve? What on earth are you talking about, lady? There is a study, it is a postgraduate study done by a postgraduate student who studied the impact of children with chronic illnesses and the impact that chronic illness diagnosis had on the parents. And we see in this study that about 50% of parents, 50%, that's a big significant amount of people, experienced a sense of grief and loss when their child was diagnosed with a chronic illness. So not only do you have anxiety, but many of us have experienced grief and loss. Well, why is that? Because we feel like, oh my gosh, they're handed this diagnosis, and are they ever going to be able to drive a car? Are they ever going to get a job? Are they ever going to be normal? Which there is no such thing as normal. So we're going to go ahead and step outside of that box, because when we talk about normal, it's like 80% of children in elementary school are on a medication. And here you are trying to get your kid back on track without the medications, without numbing them out. And you're worried about them being normal, when we know that 80% of the kids in school right now, about 80% of the kids in school right now, are on some kind of medication for ADHD or behavior. So as a parent, back to the grief and loss, you've never had time to grieve, because you were packing the lunches and driving the kids to school and taking them to soccer and folding the laundry and doing your own job if you are a working mom. And so you have never had that time to grieve, never had that time to experience that grief, because nobody died. Nobody died. Everybody's still alive, but you are in this stressful situation where you do experience grief, because you start to think, well, my kid's never going to be able to do the stuff that other kids are doing. I know I felt that way. Absolutely felt that way. You can read more about our story in the book. But my whole point of changing the topic today is that I see you. I see you speeding down the highway at 120 miles an hour in the high-speed wobble and feeling very uncontrolled and not knowing what to do and not knowing how to control that anxiety. And then you see the cop and you're like, I gotta slow down, and then you're gonna speed back up, and then you're gonna slow down, and then you're gonna speed back up. And this anxiety, this mood really, really starts to impact your child. We can see the studies, but I can tell you from clinical experience, just having you guys, all of you in my practice, is that the impact of your anxiety and your uncontrolled mental state really does impact your child. And this is why, and I'm not going to leave anybody out there to hang them out to dry. This is really why I want you to understand. I've been in your shoes. I have been in your shoes, deep, 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 dark in your shoes. From anxious to having a child who was diagnosed with a neurological tic, I have been in your shoes. And so when somebody says to me, but yeah, you can do it, that your kids live with you and you can do it, you've been doing it a long time. I've been doing it a long time, but let me tell you what, I didn't start out here. When my son was first diagnosed and we finally saw an alternative provider who really felt that food and what he was eating would help him, we were referred to a nutritionist Their nutritionist, one nutritionist in our whole town, looked solid for 6 months. I wasn't going to let him struggle and suffer for 6 months when I have this person telling me, hey, look at this paper. He is sensitive to gluten, dairy, soy, eggs, peanuts, blah, 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 blah. I didn't know what to do, but I had to come home and figure it out. I spent years. I went back to school to figure it out. But this is why I do what I do, because we are going to give you the steps that you need. When you come to work with us, we are giving you the steps that you need. We have a brand new referral provider that we are working with so that the moms who are experiencing this anxiety can talk to her about how to cope with that. I can't teach you how to cope because let me tell you, I am a horrible coper. Not a good coper. My parents couldn't teach me how to cope. So therefore, I don't have coping skills. I just had this conversation with my mom yesterday. I don't have good coping skills. So I can't teach you that, but I have great referral partners in my practice. You have a kid that can't cope and you can't teach them how to cope because you don't know how to cope like me. Then we have great referral partners where we can send you, hey, we have somebody that can teach your kid this skill. Hey, we have somebody that can teach you this skill, because together doing this with the holistic approach is going to make a huge impact on your child's mental health and their well-being and their overall symptoms.